The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. H.P. Lovecraft, The Call of Cthulhu. Persona 3's story leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions. There's a reason for that, of course. We don't know because the characters don't know. And the characters don't know because not knowing ties into the themes of the story. How to face life in spite of despair. Not knowing is one of the things that most evokes despair in us. To quote Lovecraft one more time, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. The story ends without the characters getting a clear answer, because they needed to face that oldest fear. But we are human. By nature, we look for answers. The biggest source of these unanswered questions is that the most central character in Persona 3 never speaks, and is rarely spoken about. The few people who know about her tell us very little. This is her story. This is the story of Nyx. I will be reconstructing Nyx's story, beginning as far back as we can trace it, all the way through the events of Persona 3 and into the possible futures. My most important source besides the game will be the Persona 3 Club book. This was a book released only in Japan, containing all sorts of background information about the game. For our purposes, the most important part is the final section of the book, which is a World Guide Q&A. This takes the form of an interview with Akutsuki, where he answers questions that were left unanswered by the game. Whenever I reference the book, I will include my own translation, alongside a transcription of the original Japanese so you can double-check my interpretation. And I will spare you Akutsuki's puns. They are even worse in Japanese. I will also be drawing on some of H.P. Lovecraft's writings. The Persona games have always drawn heavily on Lovecraft's ideas. Jung seems to struggle in some ways in conveying the idea of the collective unconscious. He tried to write about it in scientific terms, but many aspects of it seem to touch on the mystical. The collective unconscious is, in a sense, much older than any person. It isn't something we can ever consciously comprehend. It's too big for the conscious mind. Whatever representation we can imagine will always be woefully inadequate. And the collective unconscious seeks its own goals, in a way that seems utterly indifferent to our conscious wishes. All of these traits are mirrored in Lovecraft's outer gods. Persona recognized this and has used them to represent the deep unconscious. They capture these subtleties in ways that mere words simply couldn't. But despite the excellent use of Nyarlathotep or Azathoth, the greatest expression of Lovecraftian ideas in Persona is from the one horror not borrowed from Lovecraft. Now, let's begin at the beginning. The story begins many billions of years ago. This is taken directly from the club book, so I'll just quote it directly. In the distant past, there was a gigantic life form, the size of a celestial body, drifting in a dormant state in outer space. This life form, known as a Star Eater, crashed into the Earth, where life had just begun to form. There are several theories about the origin of the moon, but the dominant theory is the giant impact hypothesis. Under this model, about 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth collided with a dwarf planet named Theia that would have been about the size of Mars. The debris of this explosion would eventually coalesce to form the moon. It's very important that life had begun on Earth when Nyx arrived. The first life on Earth is thought to have existed between 3.7 and 4.3 billion years ago. Persona likely imagines that life began a little sooner, and that the evidence of it did not survive the impact. So we can date this to about 4.5 billion years ago. The materials that Nyx is made of follow different laws than the physical laws of the Earth. But even so, the impact of the collision was severe. In Lovecraft's work, the Great Old Ones are not bound by the same physical laws that we are. They are made of a substance fundamentally different from anything on Earth, and that makes them completely immortal. These Great Old Ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not that star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection, when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. We don't know why Nyx was dormant at this time. It may have been a cosmic cycle like what caused the Great Old Ones to slumber. But in this slumber, Nyx's body collided with the earth, and the impact shattered her body. Normally that wouldn't be a problem. Nyx's body would simply reform itself. But something strange happened. With that shock, the broken pieces of the earth became the moon, and Nyx's wave-like existence, her spirit, resided on the earth, while her physical existence, her body, dwelled on the moon. However, it was her psyche more than her body that was trouble. The waves emitted by Nyx's psyche were capable of annihilating all life on Earth. While Nyx's body was dormant, her mind remained active, and that mind was a threat to all life on Earth. But why would a mind be a threat to all life merely by existing? That has to do with incompatible instincts and archetypes. I've talked about these ideas before, but in brief, these form the foundation of our minds. Instincts are the source of energy that drive our minds, and archetypes are the patterns of thought we naturally fall into. Persona represents archetypes using tarot cards. Each arcanum of tarot is an archetype, and together they tell a story. The shadows in Persona 3 are all pieces of Nyx, and each one represents one of the arcana. But the only arcana we ever see are from 1 to 13. These 13 arcana, then, are the story of Nyx's mind, beginning with the magician and ending in death. Then the story of life on Earth would have to be what was there before Nyx's arrival. Arcanum 0, the Fool. The Fool represents potential, like the beginning of a journey. The Fool is a master of nothing, but holds the potential to master anything.
It is like the number 0, empty, but at the same time, holding infinite possibilities.
That is why Nyx's story was a threat to life on Earth. Her story was a completed story, and Earth's was one of endless potential. They could not both play out, so life on Earth used that potential to change.
I'm pretty sure the end is unavoidable. But it's kind of weird. It doesn't feel that inevitable right now, considering the vast potential inside you.
Of course, though they were primitive, the creatures of Earth instinctively desired to live, and resisted these waves of death. As a result, life on Earth evolved explosively, developing weapons to counter Nyx. That is, a domain for the shared information of all life on Earth, what is called in psychological terms, the collective unconscious. Life on Earth imprisoned Nyx's psyche within the collective unconscious. The driving force of this seal is the power of repression that comes from the fear of death, or not wanting to die. Life on Earth could not fight Nyx's strength, so it chose another approach. It embraced Nyx, made her story a part of its own. It used its will to live to seal these fragments of Nyx within itself. This meant her instincts and archetypes became a part of its mind. Nyx's immense will and her wisdom could become tools serving life. But there was a problem. That final arcanum, death. For Nyx, death means death. And that fixed end was not compatible with the potential of the Fool. But life found an answer. It changed the meaning of death. In tarot, death is not the end of the journey. Death represents a change, a painful experience that pushes us to grow, and it is a necessary point in the journey. More arcana were added following death. The story continued. A literal death was moved forward to number 20, Judgment. But even this incorporates a level of hope. A judgment implies a hope of absolution, to be judged positively. And even judgment is not the end of the deck. That is number 21, the world. Even with the end of the individual, the journey is echoed forward through time in the marks they made on the world. And so, life on Earth was able to transform its certain death into a painful experience that enabled it to grow. Nyx's psyche became the foundation of life on Earth, as Akutsuki put it. It's ironic that life has evolved to the point where it has complex mental structures thanks to Nyx, who is supposedly the embodiment of death. And so, building on that foundation Nyx gave it, life continued for billions of years until the modern day. Life continued to develop, building on top of Nyx's foundation with its instinctive will to live maintaining the seal. By this time Nyx should have reawakened. Her body had mended, but her mind was trapped in the collective unconscious. Then something happened to threaten the seal. Life developed to the point where its mind could act against its instincts. It could now think in ways that negated the instinctive will to live, weakening the seal and the pieces of Nyx it held. I'm of course referring to humans. Animals live much closer to their instincts than we do. Our more complex minds can have a much deeper conscious and unconscious that can allow us to bury our instincts. And our ability to change the environment allows us to live more disconnected from the struggles that put us back in touch with them. This threatened the integrity of the seal. Every living thing holds fragments of Nyx within, held in place by the seal. If a person were to lose their will to live, and the seal was broken, these fragments would escape, and those escaped fragments would be shadows. Just one shadow would be too tiny to awaken Nyx. She would need enough shadows to create a functional mind, and to have the strength to command her body. Having become tiny fragments of power, they first seek other fragments, that is shadows, and try to combine. Shadows will instinctively seek out other shadows, and attempt to fuse together. They'll first seek shadows of the same arcanum, until enough have fused to be able to support Nyx. And then they will begin to seek large shadows of the other arcana. Once 13 shadows, one of each arcanum, have fused, the resulting shadow, called the Appriser, will be a complete enough recreation of Nyx's mind that her body can be awakened. After that, retrieving the rest of her mind would be no obstacle. That would be the fall, the end of life on Earth, and the resurrection of Nyx. And with humanity's potential to defy their instincts, it became a real possibility. The solution to this was to create a second layer of the seal, not in the collective unconscious, but this time in the personal unconscious. Humans created myths, archetypal images that could be conduits for their instincts. Moreover, humanity unconsciously created conceptual beings in opposition to Nyx and strengthened our psyche. Simply put, it's what we would call myths. Most of them depict good gods who defeat evil gods and prevent the destruction of the world, right? The existence of these so-called gods stabilized the repression in the unconscious, strengthening the seal around Nyx. These myths were able to keep the human mind stable enough to prevent the fall from occurring. The seal wasn't perfect. After a personal tragedy, an individual might still lose their will to live. Or in a war disaster, many people might. But these events were localized enough that there were never enough such people to trigger the fall. But as time went on, human technology advanced. This allowed humans to live lives more disconnected from their instincts and from their myths, and caused a new threat to form. People who had not merely lost their will to live, but who fully wished to see life itself end. These are people who become miserable in their lives, but rather than internalize their despair, they externalize it. Their perception of the world becomes distorted. They begin to adopt beliefs not based on the reality of the world, but on their internal misery. They come to see life itself as a wretched mistake, and want to see that corrected.
You don't get it, do you? Why do you waste your time searching for a reason to live in this broken world?
Their desire to bring about the fall, ironically, gives them enough reason to live that they can hold on to their shadows. And as technology has advanced, it has let them spread their life-negating ideas to other people. If we call those who have succumbed to apathy syndrome the lost, then we can call those who seek to spread their twisted worldview and bring about the end of life the cult. As these problems were growing worse, humanity made another discovery. Researchers for the Kirijo group discovered a strange material that seemed to break the laws of physics. They called this material a plume of dusk. It seemed to be an endless source of energy. They were able to build machines powered by these plumes that could operate for a decade without any external power. And it seemed to be able to manipulate time, creating a sort of time-stop effect. These plumes of dust were in fact tiny fragments of Nyx's body that remained after her collision with the Earth. We do not know much about the research. Very few of the researchers survived, and those who did are not inclined to speak of it much. We do know that many more plumes of dust were discovered, technologies based on them were developed, and shadows were discovered. The researchers were able to gain some degree of understanding about Nyx as well. A full breakdown of what we know about the Kirijo Group's research would be long enough to be its own video, so I'll only hit the key points here. The Kirijo Group developed anti-shadow suppression weapons, what were essentially androids designed to fight shadows. The reason they were able to create something so advanced was that they incorporated plumes of dusk. These pieces of Nyx seemed to be able to connect to the collective unconscious in the same way that living beings do, enabling them to develop a mind. Several people involved in the project came to despair about life and wish for the fall. Notably, these included the head of the Kirijo group, Koetsu Kirijo, and the researcher Shuji Akutsuki. Both men would develop very different beliefs about Nyx, but both decided that they wished to awaken her and use their power within the group to try to do just that. Under Koetsu's orders, the Kirijo group amassed shadows on Port Island for experiments, in a facility they called the Cathedral of Time. They managed to fuse many shadows of each archon together into giant shadows. They would have then fused these giant shadows together into the Appriser. If they had done so, the fall would have happened then. The experiment, however, was sabotaged. The shadows escaped. The location of the Cathedral of Time became Tartarus, a physical manifestation of Nyx's mind reaching for her body, and the Dark Hour came into existence. The Shadow's ability to stop time occurring globally every night at midnight as shadows converge on Tartarus. But most importantly, the anti-shadow suppression weapons were able to subdue one of the 13 large shadows, Death, and seal it within the unconscious of a small child named Makoto Yuki. Without the final arcanum, a complete mind for Nyx could not be fused, and so the fall was averted, at least for a while. 10 years later, Shuji Akutsuki, still wishing for the fall and now working for the Kirijo group to deal with shadow-related threats, managed to find that child and arranged for him to be returned to Port Island as a student. As planned, Makoto awakened to a persona, and Akutsuki was able to integrate him into Cease, the squad he now ran for the Kirijo group, under the pretense of dealing with shadows. Makoto still held that shadow within him, and being near to the other large shadows in Tartarus caused it to reawaken. Because these large shadows are drawn to each other, the large shadows began to seek Makoto at each full moon, and the death shadow he held within would absorb them as Makoto and Cease defeated them. Once the 12th large shadow had been defeated, all 13 had been combined, and the fall should have been imminent, but something had changed. That death shadow had been in contact with the human collective unconscious for a decade, and it began to take on human traits. It took on a human form, a name, and it began to care about human beings, even making a friend. For a piece of Nyx's mind, this was unprecedented. As Pharos, he had become interested in human life, and now that he had fully awakened, rather than fulfill his instinctive duty to call forth Nyx, he chose to defy his instincts and experience life as a human. He gave himself a human form, took on a new name as Ryoji Mochizuki, arranged to live near his one friend, and repressed his own memories in what was effectively his own attempt to replicate the seal. He was able to live a happy, normal life, but it couldn't last. On the first full moon after his transformation, he awakened in the Dark Hour, and wandered back to the site where he had been sealed inside Makoto. His past returned to him, and he realized he couldn't seal Nyx away. He explained the situation to Cease, and offered Makoto a choice. Ryoji would allow Makoto to kill him. If he did, Ryoji would disperse into his constituent shadows, ending the Dark Hour and everyone's memories of it, and leaving no shadow large enough to awaken Nyx. But this would only be a temporary solution. Ryoji was not the root cause of the fall. As long as the seal was weak, shadows would continue to escape, and would ultimately create a new Appriser and awaken Nyx. With humanity's will to live weakening, killing Ryoji would only be a few months before the fall. And without the Dark Hour, there would be nothing anyone could do to stop it. If Ryoji were left alive, he would soon be forced to play out his role as the appraiser. Come the next full moon, his instincts would overpower his personality, and he would awaken Nyx, bringing the fall. But this would buy humanity one more month to try to find a solution. Ryoji believed this would be impossible, but this would not be the first time the fool had survived the impossible.
Maybe there really is some power out there that can do the impossible. And if there is, I know you all have it.
And so on the night of the next full moon, Cease went to the top of Tartarus and met Ryoji, now fully subsumed by the appraiser. As the appraiser called Nyx's body down toward Earth and rose to meet it, Makoto followed. Makoto too held fragments of Nyx within, so he could ride the same currents of attraction to meet her. And when he arrived, the fool found another solution. Life on Earth uses its will to live as a seal to hold shadows within itself, and the anti-shadow weapons show that Nyx's body is compatible with not just shadows, but also the archetypes of earthly life. Makoto allowed his mind to be absorbed into Nyx, and then his will to live, which had sealed his shadows within, could instead create a seal within Nyx, one to keep shadows out rather than in. This third layer of the seal was called the Great Seal. So long as Makoto's will for life held, he could deny shadows the ability to approach Nyx and ensure the fall could never happen. With the connection between Nyx and the appraiser severed, Nyx receded back to her normal distance, and the shadows that had been striving to reach her became more pacified. The dark hour in Tartarus ended, and the shadows that were loose began to be gradually reabsorbed into their hosts, ending the apathy syndrome epidemic. And that is the story of how the fall was averted once again. But it's a story that leaves us wanting more. The world is saved, but at a dear cost to an innocent person. That isn't something that sits comfortably for us. Is this really the only way? Are we doomed to spend forever teetering on the edge of extinction, at war with our innermost nature? Or is there something that can be done? Well, there are many possibilities for the future. The Great Seal is necessary to keep Nyx in check. There are two related problems behind this. The first is the lost, people whose passion for life has dwindled into apathy. As long as so many people live lives devoid of meaning, the fall will always be close at hand. The second is the cult, those who actively hate life. They are less numerous than the lost, but they actively work to spread their twisted worldview, creating others like them and spreading apathy. In the aftermath of the Great Seal, and the failure of the appraiser to awaken Nyx, the collective despair of the cult created a new threat. In Greek mythology, Erebus is the personification of darkness and the husband of Nyx. He's thus the perfect namesake for the manifestation of the cult's desire to awaken Nyx. This monster constantly seeks to enter Nyx, throwing itself against the Great Seal that keeps it at bay. Humans hold all of Nyx's archetypes within, so if enough of them wish, with all their being, to awaken Nyx and see the world destroyed, they could awaken her as readily as the appraiser would have. Both of these threats must be dealt with before the Great Seal can be safely removed. The lost are far more numerous, but also more easily saved. They only need one thing to live for, one thing worth protecting, one person to inspire them. The cult are more difficult to help. When you devote yourself to an ideology, it becomes part of your identity. Any threat to the ideology is seen as a threat to the self. Any thoughts that discredit it are likely to be repressed. The process of admitting that your ideology was wrong can take months or years, and often depends on support from outside. We can do things to solve these problems. We can live our lives in ways that inspire others. We can contribute to a culture that celebrates the joy of life. We can extend compassion and understanding even to those who might not seem to welcome it. These are all easier said than done, but in essence the core sin that this story points to is that we haven't loved life as much as we should. But there are also hints that something more profound may be happening within Nyx. In Lovecraft's stories, the Great Old Ones are effectively unchanging, or at least what does change them are cosmic forces, slow-moving and far outside mortal ken. But while Persona is deeply influenced by Lovecraft, it is more fundamentally Jungian, and as Carl Jung said, "For two personalities to meet is like mixing two different chemical substances. If there is any combination at all, both are transformed. The meeting with Nyx fundamentally changed life on Earth, to the point that now our existence is entirely inseparable from hers. It would follow that this same meeting must have triggered a change in Nyx. Nyx has been largely unconscious since she came to Earth, her mind bound in the collective unconscious. What pieces did escape were shadows, which represent only a single archetype, and were not complete enough to have anything resembling a mind. But more recently, that has begun to change. The anti-shadow suppression weapons are pieces of Nyx that unquestionably have full working minds, and Ryoji, due to his exposure to the collective unconscious within Makoto, also developed a full mind. Nyx is awakening, even if the Great Seal means that she can't awaken the way that was expected. When Nyx came to Earth and her archetypes began to influence life, this triggered a period of rapid evolution in the collective unconscious. New archetypes needed to be formed to resolve the incompatibility between the stories of Nyx and Earth life. Now that pieces of Nyx are finally awakening, could the same evolution occur in them? Archetypes that serve mortal, biological life forms may not make any sense to an immortal cosmic god like Nyx, and so she would need to develop new ways of thinking in response. The first archetype we see outside of the standard tarot arcana is the Aeon, represented in Aegis. The Aeon is from the Thoth tarot deck, created by Aleister Crowley. In Crowley's philosophy of Thelma, time is divided into periods he calls eons. Each eon represents a shifting of the world and of the ruling god. In Thelma, the first eon was the eon of Isis, the mother goddess. The current eon is of Horus, the child. For a being like Nyx, an immortal god that has slumbered for billions of years, and awakened in a radically different form, the eon may be an archetype needed to make sense of what has happened.
The parameters governing my behavior seem to have been updated during my time with you.
But evolution is not a clean, orderly process. It does not create one solution to a problem. It creates many possible solutions competing with each other. A few years after Persona 3, we see the Jester Arcana for the first time. The Fool's unlimited potential allowed Earth to overcome Nyx, but the Fool's nature is fundamentally incompatible with Nyx. The Fool has no knowledge and no power, and being unburdened by these is what gives it the potential to grow in any direction. But being powerless is a state fundamentally alien to Nyx. To tap into this potential, she would need a different archetype. One that holds the same promise, but in a way that she could understand. A jester is in many ways a similar figure. The jester plays the fool, but is often the smartest person in the room. He approaches the world as an outsider, which grants him a similarly unbound perspective as the fool, to see things from angles no others could. But this perspective fundamentally affirms a strange kind of power. The wit of the jester is a terrible weapon, and the jester is the one person who doesn't fear mocking even the king. Our archetypes are the foundations of our minds. We can understand the jester archetype intellectually, but there is also a fundamental arrogance and detachment from the world tied to it. To elevate something like that to a core instinct could easily create a person who revels in power and savors exercising it, regardless of morality. Such a mind could easily become a monster. These and countless more arcana will arise as Nyx attempts to reconcile with the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And because the collective unconscious is shared, these new, aberrant archetypes will manifest in people. The Great Seal means Nyx's body cannot awaken, but as time goes on, more and more of her mind will, taking myriad forms, and these will create changes in us. Remember the term Mikutsuki used for how Nyx is sealed in the unconscious. Repression. For Jung, repression is sometimes necessary, but it's never the ideal. We repress parts of ourselves that we can't reconcile with our conscious personality. But every piece we repress is a bit of mental strength we lose access to, a piece of our potential. In other words, that piece of Nyx we all hold wants to find expression, and it seeks escape to find that expression. We repress it within because we don't know how to give it that expression while remaining human. But the ideal is to instead find a solution that resolves the conflict between our repressed desires and our conscious desires. Jung called this process individuation. In a sense, the goal of Jungian psychology is to find harmony between the conflicting forces within ourselves, to recognize and accept the parts of ourselves that seem to come from a monster, and to turn them into something to make us better. Ultimately, that's what a persona user is. Someone who has managed to embrace that piece of Nyx that they have inherited, to find harmony with their shadow, such that it will choose to work with them rather than seek escape. They have solved the billion-year-old problem of the conflict between life and Nyx. And that seems to be the challenge before us now. As Nyx tosses in her sleep, the turmoil in the collective unconscious will continue to alter the human collective psyche. Either the fall will come, taking a different form than what was expected, or the fool will, once again, find the impossible solution and truly stop it. And as I opened with a quote from Lovecraft, it seems appropriate to end with one too, probably the most famous couplet in all his works. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons, even death may die. I'll see you guys next time.